Hey guys, Julian Ribs here coming at you with another daily Spire side chat. Today I want to talk about the Silent Uncommon Blur. Costs 1 energy, gains you 5 block, and it gives you the Barricade effect. So block doesn't get removed at the start of your next turn. And that Barricade effect can be stacked. If you play more than one Blur in the same turn, you'll get multiple stacks of block is not removed at the start of your next turn, and only one of those gets used every turn. So if you play 3 Blurs in a turn, your block doesn't get removed for 3 turns. Is that something? You understand what I'm saying. Alright. Um Unfortunately, like, the start of your turn in this game isn't the only thing that removes your block. You also get your block removed by the enemies mauling you with, like, their teeth and harpoons and acid slime mouths or whatever. So sometimes Blur is not very good at all. Like, if you're playing a turn and you're getting, like, attacked for 25 and you can block for 18 and one of your blocks is a Blur, it doesn't do anything. In that situation, Blur is basically just a defend. It is just a defend in that situation. And defend's an okay silent card. It's not like one you'd write home about, though. It's you don't really want your deck to be completely full of the card defend, probably. It's nice that it scales up with footwork, but yeah, not super exciting. So I can certainly relate to being in a situation where Blur just doesn't do anything because the enemy is attacking you for more than you can block, and the extra barricade effect is irrelevant. That's certainly one way to look at Blur. If you think that that's going to be a regular occurrence in your runs, then you could value Blur fairly low. And if you're concerned a lot about, like, Act 2 hallway fights in a deck that doesn't create very much block, I don't think it's unreasonable to be giving a pass on Blur for that reason. There are situations where it can be good still, especially against the Chosen. It's not too bad, but it's a less strong card for hallway fights in a deck that doesn't block very well, in my opinion. Now, the complete flip side of the coin is if you have a deck with like 4 blurs in it, maybe also a burst, so you can play your blur twice or whatever, and you've got like some footworks and some after images or whatever, so you're just pumping out 80 block a turn, blur will make it so you never drop your block. You just like have 900 block at the end of the fight. Yay. And that's like a theoretically strong thing, I guess, but it doesn't do anything. This effect doesn't do anything in the situation I just described, basically. Like, if your deck can block for 80 a turn, why on earth do you need to keep your block until next turn? Like, is your deck going to mysteriously fall off a cliff and not be able to block anymore next turn? Probably not. Probably you're just going to make another 80 block next turn. So Blur in that situation might look really strong, but actually it doesn't do much more than defend in that situation either. You might, have a turn where you only get to make 60 block, and it happens to be the turn where you get attacked for 66 and you take 6 damage. But in general, in the sort of situation I'm describing, Blur is not a particularly strong card. And I think it's easy to analyze Blur in one of those two modes. Like, either, well, I struggle to block for as much as get attacked for anyway, so why is Blur really valuable? Or, I can build a really strong Blur combo deck where I'm just keeping my Blur up all the time and I'll be invincible. And those are good things to observe, but they're also, you have to understand, they're at the very far reaches of the spectrum of what Blur can do. And what's more interesting is what Blur does sort of in the middle. And in the middle, the two most vital things that Blur does are, one, it smooths out your draws. If you draw a hand with all block and then a hand with all attacks, without Blur, this can be quite problematic for you. You're not able to output damage at all in the turn where you draw all blocks, and then in the turn where you draw all damage, you're not able to block at all, and you take a bunch of damage. With Blur in your deck, on that turn where you drew all your blocks, you play all your blocks, you play Blur as well, you block for more than you needed to that turn, whoops. But then next turn, when you draw only attacks, you have some block left over, so you're not taking as much damage. So Blur can just act to smooth out your deck, lower the variance involved in it. And especially at Ascension 15, you often are looking at, you'll add like a Sucker Punch, a Slice, a Dagger Spray to your deck early on, just to get enough attacks in your deck to, survive Act 1 and Act 2 hallway fights. You can't always just get like obnoxious fumes on the first floor and then have enough damage for everything in the entire world or whatever. And even if you did, you probably want some front-loaded damage regardless. So in that situation, you are building a deck which has quite a few attack cards in it. You can get hands which are loaded down with attack cards and don't block very well. And Blur has very real value in that situation. The more I play this game, the larger my decks seem to end up being. I just, more and more, I value picking a card which is good in the context of what's going on over thinking about building a tightly knit deck which is going to beat the Act 3 boss. Because honestly, like, most of my losses are not against the Act 3 boss. Even playing that way, most of my losses are against hallway fights or the Act 2 boss or elites that I'm forced into. Sometimes elites that I fight despite not being forced into them, but yeah. And Blur is just great in a deck like that. The draw smoothing that it provides can be very valuable. If you think about this card, it might not look like it's super powerful against, say, Act 1 elites, but actually Blur is not terrible against Lagavulin, because Lagavulin has that one turn where Lagavulin does not attack you at all and debuffs you instead, and if you don't draw 3 energy worth of damage on that turn, it just really sucks. Blur's another card which gives you something to do on that turn. So hypothetically, Lagavulin's debuffing you, you draw a hand, it has 5 defense in it, you swear really loudly and lose the run, is what usually happens. I'm exaggerating slightly, but if you can't deal damage on that turn and you've drawn all of your block cards, so you can't block with them on the turns where you're getting attacked following, that's pretty bad. But with Blur in your deck, you just play Blur and play a couple of blocks, and everything sort of works out okay. So it's actually pretty good against Lagavulin. Against the Tri-Sentinel fight, it's actually pretty good too. Tri-Sentinels put so many dazes in your discard pile that on the second and third flips through your deck, you're often getting very high variance in your hands. Some hands you'll be able to block for 15, other hands you'll draw 5 dazes. And so having Blur available means that if you draw it in a hand which can block for 15, you get 6 of that block on the next turn as well, which is great. It's likely going to save you 6 health. Yes, likely going to save you 6 health. So even at the start of the game, the ability of Blur to just sort of smooth your deck's output is quite relevant. And that's something that isn't about, like, average numbers. It's something that's about the variance in the numbers that you put out, so it might be difficult to conceptualize in the same way that you can look at a card that just has a really big number on it and say, oh yeah, that's good, that's a big number. So what even would a card with I guess Glass Knife deals a lot of damage, and you can be like, oh yeah, cool, that's cool, it deals a lot of damage, I get that, that's good. But Blur is about reducing the variance of your deck's output, which is valuable as well. The other big thing that Blur does is it lets you prepare block on turns prior to big attacks happening. And this is immensely valuable in most runs. I think the simplest way to illustrate how valuable this is to think about the champ fight or the automaton fight, the fights where the boss will attack you for 60 plus damage in one turn, but doesn't really do anything on the, turns around that turn. And if none of those fights existed, Blur, like, the fact that Blur did this wouldn't be relevant. But 2 out of the 3 Act 2 bosses are fights exactly like that. So Blur doing this is very relevant to this game. Act 2 boss is a huge hurdle for a lot of Ascension 15 runs, and Blur is quite valuable against 2 out of 3 of those bosses. And the idea is, ideally you'll pick up well-way plans to make this actually a consistent thing you can execute, but even if you don't, you can just try to use your card draw and manipulate your deck's setup and stuff to draw Blur on the right turn. good luck. The idea is that facing a damage 60 attack next turn, a lot of decks are going to just, die. Like, okay, I guess I'm dead then. But with Blur, you can stockpile an entire turn of block, then go to the next turn, be facing your 60 plus damage attack, and play another entire turn of block, and actually survive the attack. And Blur is the only card that does that. There isn't another card in the Silent Pool that lets you survive in that situation. So Blur can be immensely, immensely relevant at the end of Act 2. There are runs that I have where the only card I can imagine turning the run from a loss into a win as I approach the Act 2 boss is Blur. It's a unique effect which is immensely, immensely relevant to your ability to block meaningfully against 2 out of 3 of the Act 2 bosses. So, I wouldn't prioritize putting Blur in my deck extremely highly at the beginning of Act 1. The issue is that it doesn't block, and it's quite bad against Gremlin Knob. Or, sorry, it doesn't deal damage, is what I meant to say. And it's quite bad against Gremlin Knob. But in Act 2, if I'm coming up against Champ or Automaton, it's very, very, very likely that I'm putting Blur in my deck over almost any other card. And even in the latter half of Act 1, Blur is already an immensely valuable card for me because of how it smooths out the variance in the deck, even if you're not making use of the ability to stockpile block before a big attack. And stockpiling block before a big attack isn't only against the Champ and the Automaton. There are enemies like the Chosen who attack you for large amounts on certain turns and don't really attack you on other turns. Other boss fights Blur is useful in. There's a good chunk of value coming out of the ability that Blur gives you to stockpile a turn worth of block to prepare for next turn. So yeah, those are the two really big things that I wanted to convey about Blur. Those are what I'm largely thinking about when I'm deciding whether or not to pick it, how well my deck will be able to use those two things, how important they are to my deck based on what I see that my deck is going to be fighting. In general, Blur is a very high priority card for me, but it's certainly also a card that I completely pass over sometimes because my deck just doesn't seem to be gaining much value from that. If I'm against Collector and have no ability to draw Blur on the one turn where Collector isn't going to attack me, for example, in Act 2, Blur is just likely not very good. If I'm struggling to fight Act 2 elites right now, all the Act 2 elites pretty much attack you for large amounts every turn with little ability for you to control that. The only exception is the Gremlin Leader. But yeah, if I'm struggling to fight Act 2 elites right now, Blur is not a particularly good card. Because against fights where you do face as much damage output as you can block in a turn every single turn, Blur is just not super exciting. But in general, it's a good card for the reasons that I've outlined. And yeah, I hope you guys have enjoyed hearing me talk about it. Do some blurring. It's, a bigger philosophical point from this video is it's easy sometimes to see what a card does at its lowest potential and its highest potential, but it can be really hard to work out what it does in the middle, and the middle is what matters. So make sure that you're not doing lazy analysis of cards where you're this is the worst a card could perform, it seems bad. This is the best the card could perform, oh, it seems really cool. And then getting stuck there, because really what it does in the middle is usually the relevant thing. And it's also often quite difficult to see properly. It's quite difficult to fully enumerate what's going on in the middle of a card's output potential because it's just more complicated. Yeah, it's just a lot more complicated. Hope you guys have enjoyed the Spireside chat. I'll be back tomorrow. I do have links to Twitch and Discord and stuff below the video. I'm going to be checking out Frostpunk and playing some more Battle Mech and there's a third character coming out for Slay the Spire this week on the beta branch, supposedly. So if you don't know how to get on the beta branch for Slay the Spire, it's in your Steam. You right-click Slay the Spire, go Properties. There's a tab in your Slay the Spire properties that says Betas on it, and all you have to do is click, select the beta you would like to opt into, and click on Beta, and that'll download the beta for you. In order to transfer your save file over to the beta, if you want to do that, you go to your game files. So again, in Steam, you right-click on Slay the Spire and go Properties, and in Local Files, you go Browse Local Files. And in there, there's a Preferences folder, and you want to copy everything in your Preferences folder into the Beta Prefs folder, and that will just save all of your unlocks and stats and everything on the beta for you, so you don't have to unlock everything again. And you can play some third character sometime this week, hopefully. Hopefully it doesn't get held up or anything, because I'm super excited about it. All right. I'll see you guys tomorrow for another daily Spire Side chat. Bye, guys.